coming up.
What's the implications of this? Like, if the government, you're reporting this, you're telling them, look, you're double counting, you're inflating the numbers, you're not basically telling the truth to Canadians on how these programs are functioning. So what is the implications of that? What's the results? What happens? I can't believe what I'm actually going to say here. These funds can be fast-tracked with a letter to the Prime Minister. Down at bottom of page 8 of your report. And like I say, I hesitated because I wanted to make sure I had that quote correct. I find this quite alarming, scandalous, to say the least. Does this not concern you when you reported this and when you saw this? Does it not concern you that the world's largest companies can get access to can write a letter to the Prime Minister and say, here, we need some funding to we might reduce some emissions?
When you see continued mismanagement called out over several years with no improvements, would you agree that a full forensic audit would help to give a full picture of the mismanagement?
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Commissioner, an internal audit of grants and contribution programs revealed that the Minister Guilbeault's department was not monitoring 10% of the projects and not reviewing a further 27%. In fact, Minister Guilbeault's management of taxpayer dollars was so bad that according to the report, it represented, and I quote, potential legal and reputational damage, end quote. Throughout all your audits, have you ever noticed similar findings where the current government has failed to monitor taxpayer-funded programs?
So, as I mentioned in my opening statement, we haven't had a deep dive into any of Environment and Climate Change Canada's grant and contribution programs the last couple of years, but we have looked at several other departments' programs. One example from last year would be the Net Zero Accelerator Fund from ISED, and we did have concerns regarding that fund. In 2021, we had the Emissions Reduction Fund from NRCan, and we had concerns there as well. These are some of the examples of large grant and contribution programs that we have audited and found concerns with.
Do you recall how many dollars that involved?
How many dollars? Well, the Net Zero Accelerator Fund was $8 billion. Emissions Reduction Fund, the onshore program, which we audited, was between 600 and 700 million.
A lot of money, a lot of taxpayers' dollars that are not accounted for, that's for sure. Commissioner, have you ever conducted an audit that revealed the current government was not publicly measuring the value for money of taxpayer-funded programs?
Yes, so value for money is an important aspect of our work. In fact, sometimes one calls a performance audit a value for money audit. So that surfaced quite clearly in our most recent report from 2024, the Strategic Innovation Fund's Net Zero Accelerator Initiative. We have concerns about the failure to properly track and track value for money. We touch on it in other reports as well, and it's something that we're also looking at in our next audit regarding the Net Zero Act, as opposed to the Net Zero Accelerator. So it is something that we're quite concerned about. We have some calculations in here about value for money in the Net Zero Accelerator Initiative, and I could get into that in more detail if you wish.
Sure. Okay, well, I'm wrestling here with the mic. Commissioner, have you ever found any evidence to suggest the current government is inflating or inaccurately reporting the emissions they claim to be reducing?
That have been reduced to date, or the claims regarding future emission reduction?
Claims.
So we have a range of audits where we find that the expected reductions have been overestimated or are the subject of overly optimistic assumptions. So if you call those claims or projections, then we do have examples of that in a wide variety of reports. It's actually disappointing. That's something that's come up in reports for many years, and we've had to say somewhat the same thing in different reports over the years in terms of overly optimistic assumptions. Probably the two that come to mind most recently would be the hydrogen audit as well as the emissions reduction fund. In both of those cases, we found that the expected reductions were overly optimistic. And then in our first Net Zero Act report from last year, we also reported on some examples, for example, in the area of public transit.
What's the implications of this? Like if the government, you're reporting this, you're telling them, look, you're double counting, you're inflating the numbers, you're not basically telling the truth to Canadians on how these programs are functioning. So what is the implications of that? What's the results? What happens?
Well, as indicated in our 2021 report on lessons learned in climate change, the failure to execute plans because of double counting, as you mentioned, overly optimistic assumptions, policy decisions that may undermine initiatives, a whole range of things. The net effect of that has been a series of failures to meet targets over the last 3 decades. So it's not just an academic question about, oh, this program isn't meeting its objective or it set out an overly optimistic objective. All of that has added up over the years to a net failure to meet any of these targets to mitigate climate change through emission reductions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. DeMarco, you've been described as a leading Canadian expert in the field of environmental and policy and law. 30 years experience, close to it, in those fields. You also have a bachelor degree from the University of Windsor, is that correct?
That's an easy question, yes.
Yes, that is the source of your superpower, sir. So I'm glad to hear you say that.
Commissioner, the government launched an $8 billion taxpayer fund program called the Net Zero Accelerator. The government claimed that they could reduce emissions by giving away $8 billion to mega corporations through this program. According to your report, the Net Zero Accelerator projects, and I quote, and I got to double check this because I can't believe what I'm actually going to say here. These funds can be fast-tracked with a letter to the Prime Minister. It's down at the bottom of page 8 of your report. And like I say, I hesitated because I wanted to make sure I had that quote correct. I find this quite alarming, scandalous, to say the least. Does this not concern you when you reported this and when you saw this? Does it not concern you that the world's largest companies can get access to can write a letter to the Prime Minister and say, "Here, we need some funding to we might reduce some emissions"?
So I'll start by saying that exhibit 4.2, if I recall correctly, yes, 4.2, describes the process that is available. I do not believe that we found in any of the 17 files a letter such as that. So this describes the process that can be followed, but I don't recall there being any where there was a letter to fast track. So that's an option that's available, but you'd have to confirm for sure from the department whether they've actually used that. I don't recall having seen it being used.
So why was it there?
But pardon me?
Why was it there then? If you don't recall, I guess that's just the standards.
This is just describing the approval process, and that is one of the steps that's available in the approval process. It doesn't mean that in each of the 17 they went through all of these steps.
Have you ever seen anything like that?
Well, ultimately it's ministerial accountability to the decisions being made under this, and so we can do an audit, but ultimately, the accountability is with the minister in terms of demonstrating the value to taxpayers of these funds. We do have concerns, not so much about that letter because we didn't see it being used, but we did find examples, I think it was 3 of the 17, where they were fast-tracked without due diligence, and we do have a recommendation about that to ensure that ISED's reporting of greenhouse gas reduction commitments is accurate. The department should follow due diligence and complete the assessment for all projects before agreements are signed. So that would be our view in terms of putting into place a better due diligence process before these big ticket agreements are signed.
Why the Prime Minister? Why would you send a special letter to the Prime Minister versus someone else like a department head, like regular process? Like this is pretty extraordinary. $8 billion access fund, direct pipeline to the Prime Minister. Like why the Prime Minister? Was that ever explained to you in your audit, or did anybody ever ask that question?
Well, we're auditing their execution of the program, and we have concerns about that in terms of the value for money and the total amount of greenhouse gas emission reductions. It's up to government to decide the process, and they approve that. So I think that question would be better addressed to the Deputy Minister at ISED if he's to appear.
Deputy Minister of ISED. So that's who would issue this letter? Because this is an environment program. So would it not be the Deputy Minister of Environment that would issue? Who would write that letter to the Prime Minister?
Well, we haven't seen an example of such a letter, but my understanding is that, and maybe I should explain this a little bit better. So the Net Zero Accelerator Fund is part of Environment and Climate Change Canada's emission reduction plan, but it's administered by ISED. So it's an ISED grant and contribution program.
They can still access billions of dollars through a letter to the Prime Minister, though, correct? These mega corporations.
Well, that's what's set out in the process that they provided to us as to in Exhibit 4.2, but we didn't see any examples of that letter being sent.
Wow. I guess so. I guess you don't think it's really appropriate. The mega corporations can get free taxpayers' money through the Net Zero Accelerator Fund through the Prime Minister. Do you think there's a better process?
Well, our views on this are wrapped up in recommendation 4.63, that whatever process and approval agents they want to have in their flow chart, that due diligence should happen before the approval of these agreements. That's our view. It's up to government to decide who does what in terms of the approval chain, but we would like to see due diligence prior to the commitments.
Your recent audit of the Net Zero Accelerator Initiative found that the initiative, quote, was not part of any coherent and comprehensive horizontal industry policy on decarbonization, end quote. Similarly, Environment and Climate Change Canada's internal audit of its grants and contributions programs found them to be uncoordinated. So can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that, on the significance of these findings?
Looking at things in an integrated way, so let's start at the highest level. The three pillars of sustainable development, looking at environment, economy, and the social dimensions all together, that will lead to more effective decisions than looking at them in silos. And then looking across the federal government, it's been set up obviously for decades and centuries in departmental silos, but the world is facing a number of challenges that now do not fit very well within each of those silos. And so government has tried to adapt by putting in some horizontal initiatives to overcome the vertical silos, but they're far from doing that in an effective way. We're still seeing siloed decision making, and the proof is in the outcomes. We've now had 30 years since Canada's commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to stabilize, then reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and during that time, emissions have gone up.
I'm going to follow up on a line of questioning by my colleague, Mr. Mazur. I want to go back and ask who would have written the programming rules stating that one could fast-track approvals to the Prime Minister? Who would be responsible for that rule?
So you're looking at Exhibit 4.2 again in terms of the process.
Yes.
So that process is managed by ISED, and the witnesses earlier today would have been involved in approving the creation of this fund at Treasury Board. Who actually made the decision for that off-ramp where the things can be fast-tracked? I don't know, I guess, Monsieur Blouet, if we were given that information as to who approved the process set out in Exhibit 4.2?
We were not given that information.
So I'm not looking for a name, perhaps even a position. Who would have the authority to write that sort of a rule in place in a process?
So I would say that the process generally was managed by ISED. It would have required some level of Treasury Board approval. At least the program itself would have required some level of Treasury Board approval. But I would suggest that you speak to the Deputy Minister at ISED to find out specifically what position was involved in approving that aspect of the flowchart. I do not have a certain answer for you, unfortunately.
And I'm not sure if you answered this earlier. Is this a standard rule for departments to have in place when seeking approvals for certain grants and contributions?
Again, that's probably a question better directed to the deputy ministers and at a global level, the Comptroller General, who was here earlier. I haven't seen that particular example of fast tracking with a letter to the Prime Minister in other grants and contributions audits that we've done recently, but we've only looked at a few, and there are dozens and dozens of these programs. So it's better to ask someone who has more of a global view of this process, and I would say that would be Treasury Board.
Okay, thank you. In many audits your office has completed over the last few years, one of the primary issues that has been highlighted in those reports has been the lack of documentation and perhaps even mismanagement. When you see continued mismanagement called out over several years with no improvements, would you agree that a full forensic audit would help to give a full picture of the mismanagement?
One could scope an audit to look at it in a global sense, or one can look for the trends across our audits. I would say that both the audits I've spoken about earlier today, as well as some of other ones to come to mind, we have looked at the issue of open and transparent process and documentation, as you just talked about. We've had concerns about eligibility. We've had concerns about whether the expected outcomes are being achieved, for example, in the Net Zero Accelerator, and we've had concerns about whether grant and contribution programs are properly being measured, monitored, and verified. I can speak to those at a general level by connecting the dots amongst many reports. Whether we would need to do another report to do that, I'm not sure, but
Okay.
those are themes that have come up
Okay.
across several reports.
So a fuller audit could be in order. Yes,
Well, an audit of that level would need to be approved by the Auditor General in
Right.
terms of looking at such a large, so it would be up to her to decide, looking at the opportunity costs against other audits. But
Thank
I
you.
can tell you that these themes have already come up in several audits, and we can connect the dots at least for those.
thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm going to turn over the last few seconds of
Thank
my
you, Ms. Block.
time to Ms.
So,
Kuzi.
given the larger context of today, Chair, we have the 2019 Treasury Board guidelines, which clearly have not been adhered to. We saw the bad audit out of Global Affairs Canada. We now have a part-time minister, and I believe, Mr. Chair, that this necessitates greater oversight has been brought to the attention of the committee by my colleague. As such, I'm putting on verbal notice the following motion. Given that grants and contributions by Environment and Climate Change Canada has increased by $625 million since 2016, only 5.5% of all grants and contributions from ECCC were reviewed in a departmental audit. The audit stated that there was potential for abuse and mismanagement that may lead to reputational and legal damage, that this review was only an internal review and not independent, that the committee call on the Auditor General to complete a value for money and performance audit on the Grants and Contributions Program at Environment and Climate Change Canada and report the findings to the House. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Mr. Sousa to finish off.
So Canada uses 2005 as its baseline, right? In terms of the emissions reductions commitments. How much has been reduced since 2005?
Based on the latest official figures from Environment and Climate Change Canada, which are the 2022 emissions, it would be between 7 and 8% from 2005 levels to 2022. And the target is 40 to 45%.